So, good morning to all of you. Good afternoon, evening. We are starting a new meeting of our series of lectures regarding Raga-vartma-candrika by Sri Vishwanath Chakravarti Pad. So, we are in our meeting number 13, and today we will be discussing the second and last part of verse or prose number 12. So let's begin with a brief recap of our previous meeting where we were last week studying this 12th verse of this first part of the Raga-vartma-candrika first illumination. We were studying the first section of this 12th verse where Vishwanath is speaking about different types of practices and different types of goals as well, connected to them. So he basically mentioned some elements to be taken care of, to be aware of in the context of raga bhakti. So he mentioned how Raganuga sadhakas are advised not to engage in hangrapasana or hangrahopasana, nyasa, mudra, meditation on the moods of Dwarka, or worship of Rukmini Devi and other queens there in Dwarka, even though they may be included as limbs of art and mentioned in books such as Agama Shastras. And then he mentioned in the first part, we are on the first part of this 12th verse, that he quoted some Bhagavad shlokas to give support to his point, that how in Bhakti Marga, in the Bhakti path, even some slight deficiency of the part of the devotee in engaging in some of these aspects of sadhana, it won't be a fault. And he gives two verses from Bhagavatam to support this. The first one speaking about how someone who takes shelter in bhakti will never be in danger, even if he's running with eyes closed, he will not trip nor fall. And then Krishna is saying to Uddhava also from 11th canto, similar to what he says in the Gita. In this endeavor, there is no, in bhakti endeavor, there cannot be the slightest loss or destruction. Of course, now we will explain the context of this. But Vishwanath finished this first part of this verse saying, however, there is a fault in failing to practice the angis, or the main limbs in devotion. And he quotes the word yan from this last Bhagavad Gita verse, from the first one, that say one, implying the concept of one must take shelter of the angis of Bhagavad, like Bhagavad Dharma, like Shravan, Kirtan. And he ends quoting the famous verse Shruti, Smriti, Puranadi, and so on, which implies that exclusive devotion and Anya Bhakti to Sri Hari, which does not follow the rules, regulations prescribed by Shruti, Smriti, Puran, Pancharatra, will create disturbance or disaster. So we try to unfold a little bit the context of this first section of verse number 12, explaining how, to begin with, the Hangrahopasana has to do with identify oneself with God, or even in this case, in the context of Raga Bhakti, with the role model to follow as a reference point in the Raga mark. So it's not advised to do that. We also share some ideas regarding Mudra and Nyas. Also, thank you to Brigupad for his question at that moment. So we try to elaborate on how all these Mudra and Nyas, even though they are not considered the main angis, the main practices of Raga Bhakti, there is a play for them, as Sanatana Goswami mentions in his Hari Bhakti Vilas. So the ones who are not recommended, at least we conclude in that direction, are the ones that sometimes are recommended in the scripture in connection to devas or other personalities, or also the point of being excessively attached in an external way to some form of niyama graha, engagement in them, to the way that they distract our attention. And of course, this doesn't only have to do with Mudra and Nyas. Actually, even the main angis of bhakti can be distracting if we engage in a hypocritical way, dualistic way, like cheating way. Everything can be used for exploitation. So, of course, not the angas in themselves, but our own approach to them. But here, Vishwanath is mentioning some practices that in themselves, at least some aspect of them can really, no matter which is our honesty and intention, can take our attention in some other direction. And one of the main ones he mentions at the end, which are meditation on Dwarka, the worship of Rukmini, which is strictly connected to the realm of Dwarka Dham. And we know there is a considerable level of Aishwarya. We spoke about that. There is a difference in bhav there between the queens in Dwarka and the gopis in Braj, for example. Also, we mentioned how these practices that Vishwanath is mentioning, he's not advising them, are actually none of the main practices or even of the 64 limbs of Bhakti mentioned by Rupa Goswami, but some limbs of the limb of Archan, if you will. Also, we mentioned how we should know how to deal with other faces of the Godhead, like Ramachandra, like Narasimha, how to approach them, understanding, oh, this is my Krishna, if you will, appearing in this particular form, and so on. Sometimes we mentioned how the devotee may have to, because of some social dynamic or circumstance, lokavichar, in public consideration, he may worship some of these forms, but again, with the understanding and the sambandha, this is Krishna. So I am Bhagavan appearing in this particular manifestation. So again, Vishwanath shared 2 Bhagavad verses to show that there is no fault if a Raganuga Bhakta who is dedicated to the main limbs of Bhakti, the angis, we call them here, no fault if he's neglecting some of the injunctions in the Agama Shastras and this. But again, the failing, even if he's engaging, we mentioned if a Raganuga Sadhaka is engaging in the main limbs of Raga Bhakti and failing in his attempt, even in failing, but with good intention, proper guidance, there's no loss, no diminution. Even we spoke how one of these angis can give full perfection. So, and finally, he quoted this Shruti Smriti Puranadi verse from Brahma Yamala in the context of, we have said all this, so be careful of not speculating and engaging in bhakti with your own idea of what's bhakti and creating something new, if you will. So even though there are certain parameters and this and that, I mean, devotees can neglect something in certain parameters, but at the same time, there are certain parameters that we should learn to respect and follow. So that's a brief recap from yesterday, previous lecture from last Thursday. So today we will continue with verse number 12. Hopefully we will finish it today. And today here, Vishwanath will continue with this point, the points that he mentioned in the first part, and he will describe in detail the consequences of following some of the practices he advised us not to follow, if you will, especially connected to the idea of worshipping kings, of meditating in Dwarka, worshipping the Mahishis there like Rumini and so on. So let's go to the following section of this verse 12. We will see like 2 or 3 sections today. So I will share you in the chat the first one. There is, so I will read it. It says like this. If someone overcome by greed takes up the practice of bhajan, thinking, it is not befitting to reject the various duties prescribed in the scriptures, engaging in them, even if they are contrary to his mood, such as meditating on Dwarka, etc., he will attain a position as an associate of the queens in the city of Dwarka. This is confirmed in the scriptures. So we will show one verse from Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Says, one who has the great desire for amorous enjoyment with the Lord, but who worships him solely through Vaidhi Bhakti, will become a queen in Dwarka. In this verse, Vishwanath continues saying, the word Kevala indicates that if one is exclusively dedicated to following Vidhi Marg or Vaidhi Marg without foregoing worship of the queens of Dwarka or any other limb that is unfavorable to his desired mood, he will attain the position of an eternal associate of the Dwarka queens. The Amara Kosh Sanskrit dictionary confirms the definition of the word Keval as only. So this is a continuation and elaboration on the points that we saw in our previous meeting. So here Vishwanath is again describing some of the results of focusing our attention, our prospect, even at one point in the Dwarka horizon, in this case, for example. So let's try to unfold a little bit this section, and after that we will go to the remaining of this 12 verse. So we already have described at the very beginning of this study that scriptural injunctions are the main motivating factor in Vaidhi Bhakti. And also we spoke how lobha, or sacred greed, in the context of Raga Bhakti is prompted by sacred greed. But also, we also mentioned how Raganuga sadhakas, who have somehow or other attained some level of greed, will also engage in bhajan according to scriptural injunctions. We already explained that in detail, so I won't enter again, go back into that in detail. So there's a specific way of following the scriptures, both for the Vaidhi Bhakti and for the Raga Bhakti, specific scriptures with a specific mode and so on. So here, Vishwanath is mentioning, he's speaking about someone beginning his life of bhajan and being overwhelmed. He uses expression of overwhelmed by sacred greed. I will say overwhelmed by some level of sacred greed, which, as we already mentioned, from day one, something of that is there. Maybe it may not be a full overwhelming, but there is some sacred greed by the gift of sadhu sangha, in Raga Marga, I mean. Because he's mentioning some are overwhelmed with sacred greed, but also practicing those items that has been mentioned as not recommended. So how much overwhelmed by sacred greed is that person? That's the point. No? So affected by sacred greed, let's say, but still practicing items that were not, as we saw, recommended by Vishwanath, in connection to one's own feeling and prospect in the Raga Marg. And example, main example here, that will be the remaining of these verses, the Dwarka queens, meditating of Dwarka Bhav, Dwarka mood, worshipping queens such as Rukmini, who is the main role model to follow in the context of the type of romantic love that we find there. Even though Krishna has 16,108 queens, Rukmini is considered the main representative of the official mood in Dwarka, if you will. So if that devotee who started, if you will, who had her first connection with the Raga Marg, is not able to dismiss these elements, and is thinking basically it's not proper to give up all the activities enjoined by the scripture, I should follow all of them. So the eventual result will be she will attain the position of an assistant of the queens of Dwarka. That's what Vishwanath mentions this. And he further supports his point by quoting Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, first part, second chapter, verse 303, where Rupa Goswami mentions, as we already quoted, that one who has the great desire for amorous enjoyment with the Lord, but who worships him solely through Vaidhi Bhakti, will become a queen in Dwarka. So we will try to, of course, unfold a little bit the implications of this idea in many directions. So in this verse, also the word Kevala, as Vishwanath also pointed, the word Kevala means what's called Kritsnenaiva, or to the full extent. That's one of the applications apart from only. So to the full extent will mean that this devotee is not giving up even one item of by the Marga sadhana that may be unfavorable to one's own desire mood in the Raga Marga sadhana. Like, for example, as we mentioned, worshipping the queens of Dwarkadam. And Vishwanath is further confirming this by quoting even the Marakosh Sanskrit dictionary, mentioning that Kevala means only, not like exclusive, as we mentioned, to the full extent, fully embracing, if you will, in this case, all the Vaidhi Marga injunctions, even though one is treading the path of Raga Marga, if you will. So we already have given some examples. The point here is, of course, is you should be careful of not embracing something that will affect the prospect in the Raga Marga. If you really want to thread the Raga Marga and attain the goal of it in the form of Rajadam and some particular relationship in that realm, then you should be really intelligent and discerning about what to embrace and what will nourish your projection, your prospect, your bhajan. So besides some examples that we already gave in our previous class, I would like to share some other examples in that direction. But again, the general idea will be that if you have some desire to take Krishna, especially if it's some burning desire, if you will, some lobha is there, naturally some contempt will come for those things that are not unfavorable, for your bhajan. As we already mentioned, anukulyas sankalpa pratikulyasas bharjanam. We should make a firm sankalpa or decision, determination, resolve. I will embrace those things that are favorable to my bhajan. In the beginning, the idea may be more general, more like, I will chant the name of Krishna. I will read the scriptures, the favorable. And unfavorable will be, I won't offend Vaishnavas, I won't eat meat, or whatever. But eventually, as you advance, the same idea, no kulya sankalpa, particular bhajana, will become more subtle. So what's favorable one will be, I will chant name of Krishna in a particular way, specific names. I will study scriptures, specific sections according to one's affinity or according to the parameters of the school one belongs to. And what to avoid won't be any longer to avoid Vaishnava Parad. Of course, that will be still there, but you will find other nuanced possibilities. I will avoid, for example, getting absorbed in the queens of Dwarka and so on, because I know that may affect my destiny, if you will, somehow or other. So even other things as well. For example, even compassion may be unfavorable to bhajan, or in certain ways. That we will share some examples now. But even something like compassion, which you generally do not think of that as unfavorable, but sometimes it may represent some obstacle to our bhajan. Even in that case, that should be given up. Or even, I don't know, if my Istadev, let's take some extreme example. Even if my Istadev speaking some words that are unfavorable to my bhajan, that may happen. We will see some interesting example. Then we won't listen to that. We will think, actually, my Istadev is testing me. So let's share some examples in this regard, advanced ones, but just to give a glimpse of how the criteria for what's favorable and unfavorable is quite flexible. It can take many forms. So let's begin with one well-known example. Maybe you already know this story, coming in this case from Vallabhacharya, the founder of his own sampradaya, the Vallabha sampradaya. Once he instructed one of his disciples, a very dear, close disciple of him, and he said, when Thakurji is a way of addressing deity, he's given rest after the midday offering and arti. You go inside the temple, Vallabhacharya instructed him, go inside the altar and fan the Lord. Fan him with your eyes closed. And he said, if you hear someone saying anything, don't give any answer, and do not open your eyes. Of course, someone saying anything, the only person will be there will be the deity. So the disciple followed his Gurudev's instruction. So he entered the altar, he takes some peacock feather and started fan and started to fan Thakurji. So he closed his eyes and tried to be really following the instruction of his guru. So at one point, the disciple starts to hear someone speaking to him, saying like, hey, why are you fanning for so long with closed eyes? Like, what's happening with you? It's weird, I'm moving your fan without looking at me. Open your eyes and look at me. The disciple was hearing all this. Meanwhile, he continued fanning with eyes closed. But the disciple, again, didn't open his eyes. His guru specifically asked that. Enter, do that, and do not do this and this. What to do and what not to do. He told this criteria of anukulyasa sankalpam pratikulyasa varjanam. So he didn't say anything. He didn't open his eyes, and he continued fanning. So the voice continued saying, speak something. Say something. You will fan me, the voice was saying, but you won't talk to me. You won't look at me. If you have, and the voice continues speaking. Now, if you have so much like desire to fan me as I'm resting now, then why won't you speak to me? Like deity, of course, Thakurji, deity, Krishna himself was speaking to the devotee with full logic also. If you are so desiring to please me and fan me, Well, I'm telling you, look at me and speak to me. But disciple remained sankalpa, and he was firm in following the order of his Gurudev. He wanted to serve Krishna, but through his Gurudev, through the bhakti of his Gurudev. That's the Krishna he was willing to accept, the one who comes by following my Gurudev's instruction, not by disobeying them. So in this way, he remained fanning without opening the eyes, while Sri Krishna endeavored to make him speak, look at him, and whatever. And outside, Balavacharya was waiting. Gurudev was waiting to see what happened, to see if his disciple passed the test, if you will. So the deity curtains eventually were opened at 4 in the afternoon. So Balavacharya asked his disciple eventually, so who was talking to you? Balavacharya said, like, I was hearing a voice. And of course, you were not the one. It was not your voice. And I told you not to speak. So who was talking to you? He was testing him. So disciples say, Gurudev, I follow your instruction. I didn't open my eyes. But someone was saying again and again, open your eyes and talk to me. But I didn't. So Balavacharya said, you did well. You passed the test. So that was the point. No? Like, even if Krishna himself is appearing and saying so many things and giving instructions, disciples say that's not favorable to my bhajan because my Gurudev, for some reason or another, he asked me otherwise. Like the famous example that Guru Maharaj quotes also with Bhakti Sundar Govinda Maharaj visiting Ambika Kalna, the famous place where the Gaur-Nitai deities of Gauridas Pant are there. So he went there for doing some service for his Guru Maharaj. And when he went back, he commented to some devotee, I was at Ambika Kalna. So the devotee said, oh, so did you visit the Gauridas Pandit Mandir with Gaur-Nitai there, the original Gaur-Nitai, and so many stories behind that? And Govinda Maharaj said, no, Guru Maharaj didn't tell me to go there. Like naturally, he could reply like that. I mean, he didn't tell me to go there. He gave me another service. So that was the point. We want to see Krishna through the order, to the instruction, with the blessings, with the bhakti aik of our Gurudev. Srila Sri Maharaj once said something similar. He said once, if Krishna appears before me, I will tell him, wait 1 minute, that I will go and ask my Guru Maharaj if you are the fellow he was speaking to me about all this time. I have to confirm my own vision with my Gurudev's vision. So we have to take this in a substantial way and really understand what does it mean to be chaste and loyal to Sri Guru and what's favorable and unfavorable to bhajan. There's another example in this regard, also connecting this case to the idea of compassion. We can share this. The other one was with the Istadev. Even if my Istadev says something not favorable, okay, he's testing me. So in this case, let's go to the virtue of compassion, so much praised along our tradition. So one one thirsty man came to the cottage, to the bhajan kutir of Lokanath Goswami, that's Lokanath Goswami, Narottam Thakur's guru. And he asked for water. By Lokanath Goswami, he didn't answer. He continued absorbed in bhajan. So this thirsty man went to the bhajan kutir of Narottam Thakur. And Narottam Thakur gave some water to the thirsty man. So when knowing about this, Lokanath Goswami, he became upset. And he said to Narottam Thakur, leave this place. They were in Braj at that point. Leave this place. If you want to serve others, then there is no need to stay here. You have no real desire for bhajan. Go and serve others, feed people, give water to the thirsty. So it is said that the thirsty man that came to ask for water was Krishna himself. Because the point is, in that era, there were many homes, many places with many people in the village. So why will someone thirsty will go to Babaji's bhajan kutir for water? I mean, that's not the best place. Anyone could go to drink water. There were many wells there to drink water from. So the point is, why will someone go and beg for a glass of water from a Babaji? So it was Krishna who came there and was testing Narottam. But the higher background of this is that the point was Krishna was thinking, oh, Narottam Thakur is engaging in bhajan. in the context of Radha Dasyam, and he's on Radharani's side. So Krishna went and tested him to see, let's see what he does. So Lokanath Goswami, actually, he was aware that this person who was thirsty was Krishna himself. He was aware when Krishna went first to his bhajan kutra and asked him for water, and Lokanath was absorbed in serving Sri Radha. He had no time for giving Krishna water. So when Lokanath Goswami saw that Narottam Thakur had some softness toward Krishna, if you will, he became, like that Narottam became a little favorable towards Krishna. Lokanath Goswami expressed some transcendental anger and said, go serve him and his followers. Go with him. You have no place for him here with us. So again, I'm giving high examples, but to show you how many degrees of this consideration of favorability and unfavorability, if those terms do actually exist, we should bear in mind. So let me share you one more example. Hopefully this helps to illustrate the point, and then we continue with the next section of this 12th verse. But continue elaborating on this idea of ending in Dwarka. Raghunath Das Goswami, he quotes some nice verses. I think we have quoted some of them, at least in some previous lectures, in his Swaniyama Dashrakam, when he's presenting his own vows or resolutions in a series of verses. So from verses 2, 3 to 4, 2, 3, and 4, Raghunath Das presents a series of resolutions in a very particular way. He says, first of all, I will not live in any other holy place for even a moment, even if there is a deity of Lord Krishna there, and even if I can lovingly relish transcendental topics of Hari there with great devotees. No, he said, instead I will live in Braj, birth after birth, even if I may speak nonsense with the low-caste villagers there. I prefer the Gramya Katha of Braj than the Hari Katha anywhere else, basically. Even, he says, if the greatly opulent Lord of the Jadus, Krishna, so the point means not Braj Krishna, but some other Krishna from somewhere else, even if the Lord of the Jadus personally invite me to come and see him in Dwarka, so Dwarka appearing here, the picture, he says, Raghunath Das say, I will not leave the land of Raj, the eternal matchless playground from Radha and Krishna for even a moment. Even if I have suffered separation from the divine couple there for ages. So, but in the last verse, interestingly, he makes the important point. So he seems to be really stubborn in his idea of remaining in Braj, but we should understand why he's saying that. It's not a whimsical idea. He wants to be there in Braj for a particular purpose. So in the last verse, he's establishing this in an indirect way, if you will. He says, but if I hear, even with my earlobe, that out of loving madness, Sri Radha has gone to Dwarka, where she's clearly manifest and where Hari is holding her to his heart, then, with a jubilant heart, I will immediately fly from Braj, faster than even Garuda, the king of birds, who flies with the speed of mind, and blissfully land in Dwarka. So we should understand the context. Now, what's Dwarka? What's Vrindavan? Again, we are speaking about the mood of service. If Das Goswami wants to go to Dwarka, it's not for serving the queens, for serving Rukmini and worshiping Satyavam and Sambhavati and so on. He's just there for Radha Dasyam. The situation requires so. So he's making the point why he wants to remain in Braj, because of this Radha Dasyam. But if he has to go to Dwarka, he will do so in this particular concept. But of course, what Vishwanath is advising us or giving some caution to us in this connection that you will end in Dwarka is not because of following Das Goswami in this particular mode, but because allowing in your Raga Marga practice further and further elements of Vaidhi sadhana, that it, like again meditating in Dwarka mode, worshiping Rukmini. Here Das Goswami is not meditating in Dwarka mode nor worshiping Rukmini. He's worshiping his exclusive Praneshwari Swamini Sri Radha, absorbed in the mood of Raj. So there are corresponding destinies to these particular moods. So some words regarding the first part that today we are sharing here, regarding the 12th verse, where Vishwanath is mentioning how we may end in Dwarka. if we are allowing our practice to be affected more and more by these elements that he mentioned in the very beginning of this verse. So let's go to the next section of this verse, which elaborates on what we are already speaking here. So let me share this in the chat as well. There I send it. So the idea, he continues thinking about this topic. He says, so he already made the point, no? How you will end up in Dwarka. What will happen if you allow yourself to absorb more and more in the mood of Dwarka, Rukmini, the worship there, and so on. And he continues saying, still, we cannot suggest that just as if one worships exclusively in Vaidhi Marg, one will become Lord Krishna's queen in Dwarka. So one will attain Krishna in the abode of Mathura by practicing a mixture of Vidhi Bhakti and Raganuga Bhakti. Such an explanation gives rise to many questions, as it contains no logical reasoning. The first question is this: if becoming a servant of a queen of Dwarka means to become an associate of Rukmini, Satyabhama, and other queens, then what does it mean to become an associate of the Mathura queens? If someone says that one will become an associate of Kubja in Mathura, this will be inconsistent, since from the viewpoint of Rasa, as described in the Rasa Shastras, the position of Kubja is inferior to that of Rukmini and the other queens. So how could one get an inferior result through the practice of mixed raga and vidhi, which is superior to plain Vaidhi Bhakti? So I hope you understand the point, but we will try to unfold a little bit more. So the idea presented here basically is it's logical and incompatible to say that, okay, if you, he says here, if you worship exclusively in Vaidhi Marg, of course, exclusive worship in Vaidhi Marg, you may say, will take you to Vaikuntha, but here we are speaking about someone who wants to relate to Krishna in a romantic way. That won't happen in Vaikuntha. That won't happen by joining the Sri Sampradaya. There you will worship exclusively in Vaidhi Marg, but you will end up serving Narayan in Vaikuntha in the mode of Dasya, in Aishwarya. But here we are speaking about someone who may have started in Raga Marg, but eventually turns her attention exclusively to the direction of Vaidhi Marg, but with the desire of worship, of serving, relating to God, relating to Krishna in a romantic mode. So the end result of that will be, the necessary result of such equation will be Dwarka. So, but the point here is, okay, so what about Mathura? We already spoke about Vrindavan. We know about Vrindavan, how to reach there. We now have established how to reach Dwarka. So he's mentioning that. So what about Mathura? Maybe you can do some mixture of Vaidhi Bhakti and Raga Bhakti, and you will end up as an associate of Kubja. That will be an idea. So here Vishwanath is rejecting that proposal, because he says, actually, if you speak about Vaidhi Marg mixed with Raga, it's a higher expression of only Vaidhi Marg. So, but the point is that the Bhakti of Kuja is inferior to the one of the queens in Dwarka. So that's the point. And those are the questions that Vishwanath presents here. The first question he mentioned is, again, if becoming an associate of the queens in the Dwarka Mahishis implies becoming an associate of queens like Rumini. So which queens, servants, are we supposed to become in Mathura? That's a particular situation. And if the answer, again, if someone answered, okay, you will serve a lady, your mistress will be Kubja. Just as in Vrindavan, you have Radha, in Dwarka, you have Rukmini, Satyavan, and so on. In Mathura, Kubja may be the reference role model. But that will be totally unjust, we will say. Because again, Rasa Shastra is establishing the rasa of Kubja, the experience of Kubja is inferior to the experience of the queens of Dwarka. We already spoke about that. The queens in Dwarka has Samanjasa Rati, while Kubja has something called Sadarani Rati. We already spoke about the gopis having Samartha Rati, competent love. Samanjasa Rati has more to do with inhibited love, and Sadarani Rati had to do with more selfish, if you will, type of love. So Sadharani Rati is mainly concerned about Sambhogecha, personal desire for intercourse with Krishna, for one's own satisfaction in relation to Krishna. That's what Kubja exhibited, as you may recall in the Bhagavad. With Krishna is in Mathura, Kubja wanted to enjoy only with Krishna. He didn't want to enjoy with anyone else, with Kamsa, with anyone else. He has some exclusive focus in Krishna, but in the context of some selfish personal desire of receiving satisfaction from this union, sambhog. While the Samanjasarati of the Dwarka queens, inhibited love, may occasionally be interrupted by sambhogecha, some personal desire of union with Krishna, but generally it has to do mainly with selfless love, if you will, merely thinking about giving affection. And what to speak of the Braja Gopis and Braj, that's altogether another thing. So from this perspective, from the idea of which is represent a higher degree of selflessness, we can conclude that the Samanjasarati of the Dwarka queens is higher than the Sadharani Rati of Kubja in Mathura. So the point is, if you attain this higher, comparatively higher Rati of the queens, like Rukmini in Dwarka, by following only Vaidhi Bhakti, as we already explained, and if you say that on the other side, someone can attain a lower status of being an associate of Kubja and Mathura by following a higher practice, which is mixing Raga Bhakti with Vaidhi Bhakti, and we can conclude in one sense like that. It's a good point that Vishwanath makes, because you may think Mathura is closer to Braj, actually. In this way, it's higher. Strictly speaking, Mathura represents a higher degree of bhakti. Not Kubja specifically, but Mathura as a place. Now, we generally hear about these three areas, three divisions in Golok. Golok Vrindavan, the highest platform, Golok Mathura in between, and Golok Dwarka below. So, as we mentioned already, Vaikuntha has to do with prominence of Aishwarya. In Ayodhya, we find also prominence of Aishwarya with some little intimacy, Madhurya. In Dwarka, we find something closer to Ayodhya, but even a little bit more Madhurya, but still predominated by Aishwarya. In Mathura, we find predominance of Madhurya, but some Aishwarya. And in Vrindavan, we found pure Madhurya, full Madhurya, even though there is full Aishwarya as well, but it's totally buried under layers of intimacy. But the point here is, you may conclude Mathura is closer to Braj, closer in geography, this geographical distance, and closer in bhav. It's more Madhurya than in Dwarka. So you may conclude like this, but again, the conclusion will be, at least regarding the example of Kubja, is not fitting. Because you will say, by following exclusive Vaidhi Bhakti, that will bring forth a greater result in the form of Rukmini Bhav, following that following a mixture of Raga Bhakti and Vaidhi Bhakti will take you to the Sadharani Rati of Kubja, which is a lower thing. And such a conclusion will be totally unfair, basically. So let's go to the last section of this 12th verse, when Vishwanath is trying to conclude about this idea that he's thinking about it and sharing with us. So, 1 minute, because it seems it's too long for sharing only one time. So here's first part, and this is the second one. I will read the two of them together. It says like this, last section of this 12th verse. In this connection, so he brings some Purva Paksha. In this connection, one may present the statement from Gopal Thapani Upanishad, which says, the omnipotent Sri Krishna resides eternally in Mathura Dham with Sri Baladev, Sri Anirudh, Sri Pradyumna, and Sri Rukmini Devi. This scriptural evidence states that Rukmini, he continues, Vishwanath, was married in Mathura, and that Sri Krishna also resides there with her and his older associates. So one may feel, okay, some harmonizing is coming, but he said, therefore, attaining the servitorship of the Mathura queens, which is the supposed fruit of Vaidhi Bhakti mixed with Raga, means becoming an associate of Rukmini in Mathura. This explanation is also illogical, because not everyone accepts that Rukmini was married in Mathura. How can one become an associate of Kubja or Rukmini? He makes another point. After worshipping Sri Sri Radha and Krishna. That's the second inconsistency. Actually, when one follows Vidhi Marg, prompted by sacred greed, that is called Raganuga Bhakti. And when one follows Vidhi Marg, prompted by scriptural injunctions alone, that is called Vidhi Bhakti. The previously quoted verse, the Shruti Smriti Puranadi Shloka, provides evidence that serving Krishna without following regulations causes disturbance only. So let's try to unfold a little bit the content of this last section of verse number 12. So here Vishwanath is stating that if according with the verse of this verse quoted here of Gopal Tapan and Shruti, if one tries to establish the previous point, that you will attain Mathura, but not with Kubja, but with Rukmini there. So he mentioned actually it's not correct because not everyone agrees that Rukmini was married in Mathura. And if this is to be if this was to be accepted, he mentions another incongruity that will come, which is if you are a worshipper of Radha Krishna and you attain Kubjarati or the status of an associate of Rukmini, that will be another kind of injustice because you are not attaining the object of your worship. You are worshiping, in the case of you are worshiping Radha and Krishna. So he's trying to make all these things to converge in the conclusion he's giving here, that we will see at the end. What's Vaidhi Bhakti and what's Raga Bhakti? Even if there are scriptural injunctions, there's a form of Raga Bhakti, and if there's only scriptural injunctions, there will be Vaidhi Bhakti. So if you're worshiping actually Radha Krishna, if you have that prospect, if you have them in your altar, in your heart, that will be unfair that because of whatever situation, you will attain something else, Kubjarati or again, Rukmini in Dwarka, because you are not attaining your Istadev. While the ones attaining the position of Dwarka, as I mentioned, when we say, but someone worshipped Radha and Krishna and went to Dwarka, no, strictly speaking, someone may have begun in the Raga Marga Sampradaya, but eventually got connected to these items of Dwarka worship and become so absorbed in that direction to the point of exclusivity. That's what Vishwanath mentioned at one point, exclusively focusing Vaidhi Bhakti, but wanting a romantic relationship with Krishna. Through Vaidhi, those are the ones who, without necessarily worshiping Radha Krishna, or maybe worshiping them, but as a means to attaining that, not in the prospect in eternity. Of course, a different example, but a follower of Advaita Vedanta, at some point of her practice may worship Radha Krishna, but just as a means to another goal. Or as we mentioned, because again, if I want romantic relationship with God, but by following exclusively Vaidhi, in Vaikuntha, that option won't be available. And so there should be some place for that, and that place is Dwarka. But again, if I have Radha Krishna in my altar, if you will, in the heart, and I want to attain them, it wouldn't be fair to end somewhere else with Rukmini in Dwarka, with Kubja in Mathura, and so on. So again, Vishwanath makes that point. That would be fair. That wouldn't be fair. So here again, Vishwanath also, to further this point, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, he comments to the verse of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu that he himself quoted here, the one that says, if you have desire for amorous enjoyment with the Lord, but worship him solely, he said, exclusively through Vaidhi Bhakti, you become a queen in Dwarka. So he makes a point, solely, exclusively. So Vishwanath comments that verse, further confirming this point. He says that if someone desires for amorous enjoyment with Krishna without eagerly longing for things related to that, such as braj, and does not give up items of worship such as worshiping the queens and meditating on Dwarka, however unfavorable they may be, and thus serves in the Vidhi Marg fully, he will become an associate of the queens in Dwarka. So again, that may not happen from one moment to the other, but eventually one's worship may be turning itself more and more in that direction. So we have also another alternative, a nuanced alternative in the context of what if I worship Radha and Krishna, I want to attain Radha and Krishna, and of course, as we know, in the Raga Marga, there is a beginning of certain Vaidhi elements there. We already spoke about Ajata Ruchi Raga Sadhana, but eventually one is to integrate those things and to make all them part of, if we will, a higher synthesis of Raga, and everything will be fully embedded in that. But what if somehow or other my worship of Radha Krishna still maintains, and my prospect in that worship still maintains certain elements of Aishwarya on a certain level? What will happen? Where will I end? Because Dwarka, there is no Radha and Krishna in Dwarka, there's no Radha Krishna in Mathura. So where will I end in Vrindavan? Is it possible to attain different degrees, if you will, of destination in Braj itself? And yes, the answer is yes. So, for example, those who on the other side, again, decide to relish the sweetness of Radha and Krishna in Vrindavan, but still practiced by the Marga Vajan on some level, of course, not fully, but with items, again, such as the one we mentioned, Nyasa, Mudra, and elements like this, and especially being influenced by them and some other things regarding Aishwarya, as we will see, they will not attain, again, Krishna in Dwarka with Rukmini, of course, because they do not have that aspiration, but they can also not attain Radha and Krishna in Vrindavan in the fullest sense of the term, in the most intimate Madhurya section, because they lack the worship on the path of Raga. They may, of course, some Raga is there, because if not, you are not pointing to Radha and Krishna in Vrindavan. But there is some mixture and prominence of Vaidhi. And in time, that remains. That's my point. So my point is, since those devotees will have a predominance of certain awareness, for example, of Krishna as God, Aishwarya Gyan, in their worship according to the path of rules and regulations, and they nourish that, it's not that they embrace that as a beginning point that they need to embrace in order to forget about that, but they somehow or other, because of association and so on, receive some sanskars, continue in that direction. That person will attain Radha and Krishna, but in a portion of Vrindavan called Golok. Of course, when we speak about Golok Vrindavan in the spiritual world, at the same time, our acharyas speak of two forms of Golok Vrindavan. One called the Gokul in Golok, if you will, and the Golok in Golok. And Golok in Golok, sorry, I don't want to confuse with the terms, refers to a section of Vrindavan in the eternal Braj where the majesty of Krishna prevails and will correspond to the worship of these devotees. So these devotees want to attain the Vrindavan, let's say, of pure sweetness, the Gokul in the Golok. And sometimes the terms Antarmandal and Bahirmandal have been used also. Antarmandal means like the inner circle, and Bahirmandal means like the outer, external circle, still in the Braj. This has been described by our Goswamis. And this is not mentioned here in the Raga-vartma-candrika. Here I'm making some elaboration of what Vishwanath said. For example, in his Stavamala, Rupa Goswami, he describes Golok as a Vaibhav of Gokul. Vaibhav means, like, in this case, like majestic manifestation of Gokul. So this kind of course, this also can be applied, the terms Golok, Gokul, to Golok like Vrindavan in the spiritual world and Gokul Vrindavan on the plant earth. But also there is some application of these two terms in the spiritual world, as we were explaining here. For example, when Krishna showed Vaikuntha to the Brajavasis in the 10th canto, chapter 28, so-called Vaikuntha, actually Krishna was showing, according to Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, Vaikuntha Golok. So that refers to the majestic portion of Golok Vrindavan there. Also in Vaishnav Tochani and in Lagu Bhagavatamrita, this is explained. There's this expression, Yatu Goloka Namashat Tacha Gokula Vaibhavam. What is called Golok is Gokul with a majestic aspect. We may call it, again, Aishwarya Golok, Vaikuntha Golok. Different expressions are there. In this book, also in the Lagu Bhagavatamrita, Swarupa says, Taratma Vaibhavatam Chatasya Tan Mahimonnati. Gokula's form of majesty, referring to Golok, arises from showing greater powers. So what is called Golok is like the majesty of Gokul, if you will, Gokula Bhaibavam. Gokul, on the other side, is known for its supreme sweetness. And sweetness means Madhurya, and Madhurya means intimacy, lack of Aishvarya in every sense of the term. And Golok, let's say, is a portion of Gokul, which displays majesty. Guru Maharaj will say there will be larger banyan trees there. Of course, again, this is not the mode of Vaikuntha in itself, Aishvarya with Narayan. But in this place, in this section of Golok, which again is an eternal possibility, the devotee will have awareness that Krishna is God, for example. Sometimes our Acharya will say in that section of Vrindavan, Radha and Krishna will be in Swakiya. They will be officially married, overtly married in every sense. While in the Gokul, in the intimate section of Vrindavan, there will be Parakiya Bhav. So I will say that there are even nowadays certain Gaudiya missions, if you will. Of course, there are different individuals in the mission, but in a general way, certain missions are mainly promoting this type of attainment, even without their knowledge. But by the way they approach, they address Krishna, they address their practice, even though they speak about Radha and Krishna and Vrindavan, they lack certain elements of the Raga culture, and they will most probably be focusing in that direction, which is depicted in the scripture. For example, when in the Brahma Samhita is very much connected to this Golok portion with the verses ending of Govindam Adi Purusham Tamaham Bhajami. It means I worship Govinda, the Adi Purusham, the Supreme Lord. No one in Gokul will address Krishna as Adi Purusham. The Brahma Samhita will say Lakshmi Sahasra Sata Sambramana Sevyamanam. No? There in Vrindavan, Krishna is worshipped by Lakshmis. So that is Aishwarya Golok. This Golok is Vrindavan, but it's Aishwarya Golok. There the gopis are Lakshmis, if you will. Govinda is Adi Purushan, the original person. Prabhupada's own statement, Supreme Personality of Godhead. Of course, I'm not saying that he's there in the outer section, but the way he was conveying his teaching, he was trying to present, of course, make a point and present the Aishwarya of Krishna. So it's okay to speak of Krishna as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, but eventually as our worship progresses, we won't be feeling, if we are properly advancing a Raga mark, we won't be feeling the inspiration to call Krishna the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the Lord Krishna. I mean, we will call him Kanhaiya Lal, Radha Raman, and in the local names, village names. Lord, the word Lord, of course, again, Prabhupada made a very expert mixing between Aishwarya and Madhurya, trying to present Krishna, but of course considering even the sensibilities of the time, of the people and the cultural stuff. And again, in the beginning, it's important. Yes, Krishna is Tu Bhagavan Swayam, he's the Supreme Godhead, he's the Lord, he's the Adi Purusha. But eventually, if we properly embrace that in the proper context, we will tend to see him in other eyes. With, again, the names that come from the local folklore of Raj, Kanhaiya Lal. That's it. That's one of the names. So this takes me to the idea of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Bhaktivinoda Thakur, once he mentioned that in Ruchi, our prayers will be heard, will be heard by Braja Krishna in Gokul, in the intimate section of Vrindavan, when we reach Ruchi. So what's the point here? That before that stage, generally, our chanting is not fully endowed with this insight that Krishna is Kanhaiya Lal, Krishna is Jashodanandan, Radha Raman, and so many other names that Krishna is named after there in that section. So before this stage, most probably, we are not feeling Krishna as he is. Prabhupada will say about Gita Siddhis, so we have Krishna as he is in this Antarmandal, in this Gokul of Golok. Generally, we address him with certain level of Aishwarya. So since we have another conception of him, that will impact on the aspect of the absolute that will reciprocate with us. But when we reach Ruchi proper, in the context of Raga Marg, Jata Ruchi, Raganuga, Sadhana Bhakti, not only we will be informed in our conception, but some Ruchi, some taste, some feeling will be there. So our chanting will correspond with that aspect Krishna, which resides in the inner mandal of Vrindavan. So to finish, some few words regarding the last words of Vishwanath in this last part of the 12th verse. So all this idea is Vishwanath is trying to make a point with all this and trying to converge in a particular idea as to further pound the post regarding the difference between Vaidhi and Raga. So his conclusion is, in the last part of this verse, he mentions that when one follows Vaidhi marg, but this is prompted by sacred greed, this bhajan is still called Raga marg, as we already explained. And when one practices Vaidhi marg bhajan, prompted by scriptural injunctions, that's called Vaidhi marg. And in this context, Vishwanath quotes the Brahma Yamal again. He re-quotes this verse, which says, Sruti Smriti Puranadi again. If you practice worship of Krishna, basically, that is not based on certain principles of revelation, is described as a social disturbance of disaster. In other words, he's saying we shouldn't speculate some different process apart from the possibilities that he has described here, or that are actually described in Shastra. No? Different processes and different destinies, as he has described Vrindavan, Golok Vrindavan, Gokul Vrindavan, Dwarka, and so on. So, as we already explained in this connection, in the beginning, our approach to Raga-marg will be a little bit diluted, if you will, because genuine taste for the expert, passionate love of the eternal Brajavasis is not there yet, fully. So this Raga-marg will be somehow or other mixed with Vaidhi, as we already explained. Ajata Ruchi Raganuga Sadhana Bhakti. Jiva Goswami has generously allowed us to be part of the Raga-marg from day one in this context. And eventually we have to awake this Ruchi, this Lobha that we were describing, which means basically eventually to have no taste for anything else but the worship of Krishna in this particular mode in Braj, purely in a favorable way, anukulyana, as we are speaking, anukulyana, in a favorable mode, not allowing elements that may dilute our giving of pleasure to him in that particular bhav. As we mentioned, the Swarup Lakshan, the main attribute of this is hearing, for example, Shravan Kirtan, as we already mentioned, about Krishna in Vrindavan, that particular way, and worship him accordingly with great longing, gradually eagerness, thirst, sacred greed, lobha, gradually. And the Tatastha Lakshan will be in that context, losing taste for everything else but that. So in that direction, the point is our practice should be progress gradually. Losing interest, again, for those items, as Vishwanath mentioned him here, that may affect our prospect in Raga-marg and so on. So some topics I wanted to share, and here we finished our 12th verse. So we have 2 more verses remaining for the first illumination, the first part of the Raga-vartma-candrika. So we will continue in our next class on Monday with the 2 remaining verses. The 13th verse will be an introduction to those things that will be fully unpacked in verse number 14. But all these 2 verses, 13 and 14, will further elaborate on the content of this 12th verse, actually. So it's not over here about these topics. We will continue unfolding them. So I will finish here, and if you have any questions before finishing, of course, we have some minutes.
I have a question. It's Mahara.
Yes, Mahara.
I thought that I had read a story recently in one of the books that you recommended, that Radharani had approached it seemed like one of the Goswamis, that because he had told his disciple to do something against what she said, and she said so, and didn't she say something like, but you're thinking you're better than me or something? Do you remember that story? I'm not sure. I can't remember it, but it just seemed like she was, you don't remember it.
I'm trying to remember, but I cannot, because sometimes there may be also stories that have similar ingredients, if you will, in them. So I will prefer that you can find exact reference and story, and in the next lecture, maybe you can present the question, since we will continue speaking about topics connected. So we can go to the point more specifically.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, thank you. So what else? Any other question?
Dandavat Maharaj, I have a question.
Yes, Rigupal.
Thank you for this explanation of Goloka in Gokula. This makes sense.
Mm.
But is there any praman for it?
Praman for it?
Yeah.
Well, I think I shared some quotes from Raga-vartma-candrika and Vaishnava Tosani. Those are connected to those two sections in the Paravyam in Golok. I share you, for example. I mean, I shared them. Were you there in the class? I don't know. I share some section from Vaishnava Tosani, from Raga-vartma-candrika, from Stava Mala, Rupa Goswami. I have the numbers. If you will, I can share you later the verses of, for example, Raga-vartma-candrika, so you can go specific verse. But they are
okay. I didn't see this thing in the chat, but I will read it.
Okay. But I can show you the praman. But here I show you how Rupa Goswami is describing this Golok as the Vaibhav manifestation of Gokul. Vishwanath is explaining in the Bhagavatam the Krishna Vaikuntha Golok, and Vaishnava Toshani also speaking about what is called Golok is Gokul with a majestic aspect. And again, it's not only in connection of the earthly Vrindavan and the heavenly, if you will, Vrindavan, but to the divisions there in the eternal Vrindavan, if you will.
And that's also mentioned like that in those places.
Yeah, I mean, it's explaining the context of describing that place, if you will. No, it's in the context of not speaking about earthly Braj in this case. No.
Okay, I understand.
But I can share you later, if you remind me, if possible, I can share you some exact quotes that you can also continue your research. Thank you. So any other question before finishing?
Haribol Maharaj, I could ask a practical question.
Okay, the one you like the most, no problem, Haripriya.
Yeah. So it's about the unfavorable things to bhajana or bhakti that you were speaking in the first section of the lecture. So my question is that sometimes good and nice things can kind of turn to be obstacles or unfavorable to the growth of bhakti or faith. For example, they just, even though they bring nice things to the society, they take so much time, and then of course you can't use that time to do some other things like deepen your bhajan, for example. So my question is that we are kind of advised to reach for our ideal and kind of like go for it, but then at the same time also we are advised like not artificially give up things like that we don't really want to give up. So can you say a couple of words about how to find a balance between there?
Yeah, thank you for your question. It's an important point, and I try to make that clear. For example, when I gave the examples of Narottam Thakur and Lokanath Goswami or Balavacharya, I mean, these are high examples from people in the Leela, and I want to show till which reach this consideration will have to be there, because my point is Lokanath was criticizing Narottam for being charitable and giving water to someone thirsty. So my point is, you hear that story and I think, okay, so if someone is thirsty, I won't give water because Gurudev will be angry with me. And that's not the point, no? I mean, because if you understand the context, I mean, Lokanath knew that the person was Krishna and they were absorbing Radha Dasan. So we are speaking in the highest dimension of service. So we cannot imitate that, as you mentioned. So we should understand how to express that in our particular situation. Of course, each one's situation is different. For example, this is this famous example that Guru Maharaj sometimes quotes, that some disciples, I think it was some Prabhupada disciple that was taking darshan of Srila Siddhar Maharaj, and he mentioned, do you know what, Guru Maharaj, sometimes we go in the streets here in India, we see people in the streets living like homeless persons and they are hungry, and sometimes we feel sorry for them. So the point of his mentioning was the sometimes, like implying we may be Maya because actually that's their karma, and we shouldn't be suffering, and we should be absorbing, culturing the highest degree of conception given by Sriman Mahaprabhu. So it seems that still those things affect us. So that means we are not so nicely situated. Something like this was the implication of his question. So he said, we feel sorry. I feel sorry for them sometimes. So Srila Samarasa replied, why only sometimes? Like implying, actually, if you are really going for the highest ideal of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, first you will have, of course, in the context of doing that, there will be so many layers that you will go through, and one of them is compassion, for example. I mean, that's one of the qualities of the devotee. And of course, some will say, yes, but compassion is only sharing Harikatha, the topmost gift for humanity. What the purpose of feeding the poor? That relief will last for only some hours, and still they will be hungry again. But we'll see that many of our acharyas were favorable in that direction. Of course, not to the point of saying this will replace your sadhana. And again, there are different devotees in different stages. And some devotees will need still in their practice to really nourish their human side. And again, that's not necessarily a sin, if you will. That's not necessarily something wrong. They will need to engage in experiences that will make them attain sattvic experiences, not to get closer to a sattva platform. But again, the point is, there's the risk of also with that. I mean, you may say, Maharaj, I need to do some social work and helping some people or whatever. I feel in my nature there's a necessity as a human. If I'm not accepting that, I feel I'm just being evasive, and my so-called practice will lack of certain honesty. And I will say, one may say, okay, you can do that in a certain context, try to whatever, give prasad and try to connect them somehow or other with a higher degree of conception. But mainly your predominant thing will be a human thing, sattvic thing. But you can also become entangled in that and thinking, oh, this feels so nice that I will continue doing more and more and more and more and more, to the point that you ended up neglecting your sadhana. And of course, you want to attain Golok Vrindavan by feeding the poor. So that's also a point. But again, it's not black nor white. No, it's not that, okay, so if I know I want to attain that, I will reject that altogether. No, we can engage in certain attitudes. That's what we might call Arup Siddha Bhakti, Sangha Siddha Bhakti, maybe not Swarup Siddha Bhakti in the language of Jiva Goswami. Swarup Siddha Bhakti means activities which are inherently devotional, like Kirtan, Bhagavat Shravan, these bhakti activities. Feeding the poor, being compassionate, having a bath, cleaning the toilet. All those things are not bhakti in themselves, but they could be practiced in the context of bhakti, in the context of your bhakti project. But for this, you need the Swarup Siddha bhakti activities in your priority list. No? So naturally, whatever you do that is not intrinsically bhakti may become bhakti by the strength of those activities of bhakti that are inherently bhakti. So in that sense, it's not wrong for a devotee to be compassionate, tolerant, humble. Actually, Mahaprabhu is describing this as very important things to properly chant the name, but the way he's promoting these virtues is in the context of kirtan. No? By being a devotee, we receive a particular orientation to what does it mean to be compassionate, to be humble, to be tolerant, because there's people everywhere being compassionate, tolerant, and humble, and not necessarily being devotees. They may be atheistic even. So it's a particular type of approach to each one of these virtues that we need. And for sure, we need to be compassionate. We need to exercise our human side to reach this level, as Guru Maharaj will say, of universal compassion, even before reaching the experience of Bhakti Rasa. Bhakti Rasa is the highest end of our Sampradaya, but before that, we need to be firmly grounded in proper foundation of having a compassionate heart for every living being. As the scripture says, you will find Another sorrow is my own sorrow. Kripam buddhija apara dukha dukhi. You won't be suffering for yourself, but you will be suffering in a compassionate way for others suffering. All things have to be there, because if not, you can take really a very high theology, as we have, as an excuse to avoid your human side. And in the name of being transcendental, you end up becoming inhuman. And we are, transcendental means transhuman. And transhuman means the word human remains there, but you add the trans. So humanity is transcended in the higher synthesis. Still there's humanity. Krishna is in his Nara Lila, but it's not inhumanity, no? So there is a place for that. So according, again, I'm giving a general answer because each one of you and of us are in a different step of the ladder, devotional ladder, but all of us should be carefully balancing all the things, and we should measure that according to how do we feel. Are we balanced? Is our practice sustainable? Is realistic? Is sensitive? Or is just a fanatical thing that we're following stuff from an ego side, like I am doing the higher thing, but how is our compassion? How is our empathy? We should learn, spend some time daily thinking where we are in those terms. So some ideas. I hope that helps, and thank you for your question. Okay, so I think we are done now. If there is any other question, I don't know. If you have any other question, we may receive maybe one more before finishing. If not, we will meet next week. Yes, I think so. So we'll meet next Monday, one day before Sri Krishna Janmashtami. So that will be a very nice, auspicious preliminary function for such a nice moment. So thank you very much to all of you. Srila Gurudev ki jai, Sriman Mahaprabhu ki jai, Sri Harinam Prabhu ki jai, Sri Raga-vartma-candrika ki jai, Sri Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur ki jai, Gaur Bhakta Vrinda ki jai, Gaur Pramananda Haribo, Manchakalpataru Vishtakripa Sindhubhyaiva cha, Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Nanta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda ki jai, Gaur Haribo.